Why would you ever want to do this? I don't know, but you can. Now, calm down, PCMAR guy in the comments section, already furiously smashing on his keyboard something along the lines of, well, the Mac sucks and this is dumb. This computer costs $6,000? I can build a PC for like a quarter of the price that has way better performance. Look, I know, okay? I'm a brother in arms in the PC gaming scene. But you gotta admit, it would be pretty cool if a Mac could finally play video games, at least competently, right? Exactly, so let's try it. The Mac Pro base configuration retails for a whopping $6,000 US, and it comes with a Radeon Pro 580X GPU. Now, there will be a lot of defenders of Apple that will state that, hey look, this isn't a bad GPU, it's just one that's not very good for gaming. You know, on a Mac you do real work, and that it's more competent as a compute GPU for creative apps, but that's just not true. It benchmarks in both compute and gaming in lockstep with the AMD RX 580 because, go figure, it's the same card. That card was released in early 2017 with an MSRP of just $299. On a $6,000 machine, it is a bad GPU. Now, in OS X, the Mac App Store version of Shadow of the Tomb Raider runs Apple's Metal Graphics API, rather than something like OpenGL, which, akin to something similar like DirectX or Vulkan, is far more efficient. But the game still only pulls an average of 28 frames per second at 1440p max settings. Now, that may be bad optimization on the developer's part, but that's just embarrassingly bad. It's nearly unplayable. So we're gonna need to try something else. And luckily for us, the Mac Pro has these little things called PCIe slots. You may have heard of them. Now, there are 8 PCIe slots in Mac Pro, and they support standard PCIe power headers. So we don't have to use one of Apple's fancy dual slot MPX GPUs if we don't want to. The card I've elected to use, primarily because I already have it in my PC VR rig, is an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti. Now, the astute among you will point out that as of macOS Mojave, NVIDIA's WebDrivers are no longer supported and operational, and that's unfortunately true. You boot into macOS with the GTX 1080 Ti installed, and the Mac recognizes it as some generic, unknown VGA-compatible controller card, aka macOS completely ignores it. And you might also be aware that given the necessary hardware identifiers, we can't really downgrade the OS to, say, High Sierra. Mac Pro ships with Catalina, and that's the system version that it has to stay on. So what are we to do if we want to game with an NVIDIA GPU? Well, we run Windows. Since roughly the era that Apple switched from IBM PC processors to an Intel x86 architecture, which you can learn about here in a previous video I made if you don't already know about it, you've been able to partition your boot volume and boot into Windows natively. Your Mac suddenly becomes a PC. Kinda. You see, upon boot, Apple tries to install a bunch of drivers that add support for things like Apple's keyboard and mouse, sound card, networking devices, and more. It's a necessary and important install. But what it also does, somewhat annoyingly, is install Apple's graphics drivers and set them as the priority option over all other GPUs. What this means is when we install NVIDIA GeForce Experience and the latest graphics drivers for our GTX 1080 Ti we just installed, nothing happens. And plugging a DisplayPort or HDMI cable into the machine just results in a black display. That's obviously a problem. I attempted to circumvent this by downloading something called DDU, Display Driver Uninstaller, which removes all traces of graphics driver packages from the OS. Running this appeared successful, and the AMD GPU showed up as a generic Microsoft Basic Display Controller, with our GTX 1080 Ti as the primary display output. Perfect! Well, nothing's perfect in this world, I guess, because upon rebooting the system, Windows and Apple softwares had completely reinstalled the Radeon drivers I had just deleted. So my only workaround was to follow a tutorial on Microsoft's website, which allows you to prevent the automatic install of drivers. After doing this, I manually uninstalled and disabled the AMD GPU drivers that the Boot Camp utility had installed, and it's been fine ever since.
It just works the way it ought to. So it all just works. It just all works. It just, boom, pops to life and works.
That's a joke if you didn't pick up on it. With the GTX 1080 Ti installed, it performs mostly how you'd expect a GTX 1080 to perform in any other PC. I will admit that my FPS was a little bit lower on this machine than my overclocked i7-8700K I run at home, but I suspect that to be more of a fault of the lousy Intel Xeon W3223 CPU inside my Mac Pro more than anything else. Now, yes, Smarty Pants, it's true that with a CPU that has 8 relatively powerful cores, virtualization of Windows within macOS might not be the worst idea in the world. Except, it is, because while VMware Fusion Pro and VirtualBox both support VTD, IOMMU, and generic PCIe pass-through, they can only pass through devices which are recognized and supported by the host OS. In this case, macOS Catalina, which again doesn't support NVIDIA. And running an NVIDIA GPU just for the occasional gaming session in boot camp sounds preposterous. Then again, so is the notion of owning a $6,000 computer with a 256 gig SSD. That said, I wasn't really happy with booting into Windows via boot camp. Having an idle GPU I couldn't use in macOS, and lower performance than expected out of the 1080 Ti due to either the CPU or weird driver issues in Windows. So I did what any reasonable YouTuber that isn't sponsored on a particular video would do, and I spent far more money than budgeted for this project by purchasing an AMD 5700 XT at Best Buy. Now, this might not be the most expensive GPU from AMD, but it's the latest, the most gaming-focused, and it's supported by macOS Catalina. Those are all great things. Installing it was just as easy as the NVIDIA card, by opening the Mac Pro's lid, releasing the PCIe bracket thumb screws, sliding that PCIe master lock switch, which is so freaking cool. Listen to the way it sounds. And inserting the GPU. Now in Windows, the card was automatically detected and the drivers were installed, as well as AMD's Adrenalin 2020 software, without a hitch. Now, gaming performance was just slightly lower on average, probably only 2 to 3% than the 1080 Ti, which is a much closer margin than you would probably see on a PC. That delta is probably 5 to 10%. But remember, we were having performance issues with the GTX 1080 Ti. That's pretty awesome for a $350 graphics card, eh? But macOS is where we really want to see support. And support we see. It's really obvious when running a Geekbench metal test just how much better that inexpensive $350 GPU is than the stock 580X. It's embarrassing, actually. Apple needs to ditch that card. And perhaps more surprisingly, the card stayed pretty quiet and fan curves never reached 100%, which I think is a testament to the Mac Pro's front-to-back cooling system. And it might end up being a surprisingly excellent alternative to those expensive MPU cards that Apple sells. I tried yet again to get gaming working on a virtual machine, but to no avail. VMware frustratingly only supports DirectX 10 when using the Mac as a host computer. Hardly helpful for running any game made in the last decade. Now, Parallels does have DirectX 11 and 12 support, which is awesome. But despite allocating half of my CPU cores, 8 gigs of RAM, which is annoyingly the max for a VM in Parallels, and most of my GPU VRAM, performance was abysmal. And I was lucky to pull out 25 frames per second in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p. It's not necessarily that good performance couldn't be achieved or possible, it's just that VMs, due to the lack of graphics APIs in macOS, have to translate DirectX to OpenGL, which takes a massive hit to performance, and also doesn't have feature parity, so compute shaders and other important features are missing. TLDW, a Mac can absolutely game when it's pretending to be a PC running Windows. Now, AMD GPUs are a better buy, thanks to support in macOS Catalina, as well as Windows Boot Camp driver support. But should you buy a Mac Pro to game? I mean, look, no, absolutely not. If you already have a Mac, however, and you'd like to start gaming without going out and building a gaming PC, something like an eGPU dock or Boot Camp may be a decent place to start. Check out my videos on how to do that here if you haven't already. Well, folks, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, that other button seems to work okay too. Get subscribed for more awesome tech videos like these, but most importantly, and as always, stay snazzy. See you later, folks.